All right, so I hope this one will be a short one. If you've been following the videos on my metaphysics playlist regarding the existence of God, then you know that I went through a series of arguments trying to explain the concept of God and provide an argument for its existence. But after a while, I realized that there are some details in the argument that I just made much more complicated than it was necessary, or there were points that were not clear, or some specific mistakes that I made. And so I'm trying to just go through them and fix those issues just to improve the overall argument. So if you've looked at the argument, the basic idea is that so if we start from the principle of sufficient reason, we say, okay, if we have something that it can be different from what it is in terms of its, for example, existence, or for example, its location or its color or something, then we need a kind of causal explanation to explain why we have that specific case. So for example, if something is in one position, but it could have been a different position, then we need a causal explanation. Why this specific position? Why is it in this position and not in the other positions? Or if something is contingent, we need a causal explanation why, what was causing it to exist at this moment when it is possible for it not to exist. So the basic idea was that. So we started from that kind of principle, and then we started applying it to things that exist. So we started by looking into existence, and then say, okay, if something exists, is it possible for it not to exist? And if it's possible for it not to exist, then we would need an explanation for that. And then we just keep applying that principle until we get to necessary beings, and inside that necessary beings we keep applying the same principle, and then we get into one necessary being whose essence will be existence. But now during these steps, there are a couple of points that I need to point out. So I won't go into details of the argument. You can watch the videos if you want. I just want to fix and patch some of the things that I just made it more complicated than necessary. So one of the things was trying to explain why the infinite series is not possible when we go from contingent beings to necessary beings. So the idea was that if we have something contingent, it's possible for it not to be, then it requires a cause. And the cause cannot be itself, because something has to exist to be able to manifest its power, or to be a cause, which means that, okay, if something can cause itself to come into being, it means that it has to exist before it exists. That just doesn't make any sense. So if something is contingent, then it has a cause outside of itself. For example, if A is contingent, then it has B as a cause. And then we ask, okay, what about B? That will lead to C, to D. And the question is, can this go on forever? And in the videos, if I remember correctly, I'm not sure, I use the example of a society in which everyone can only write a book if another book has already been written, and they can only copy from it. So imagine you have a society, and in that society, everyone can only copy an existent book. That's all they can do. And the question is, in that society, will we have a book in that society? The relation is that in some of these chains, there is this particular property that each one of those members in that chain can only exercise its causal explanation as long as the previous member has caused them to exist. So for example, B can only cause A if C has already caused B, because something that does not exist cannot have any causal power. So it's the same thing with the society and the book. So each member can only write a book if they borrow the content from another book that someone else has written. And now the question is, can this go on forever? Or in other words, is it possible for every member in that society to be able to only write a book if someone else has written a book? Or in case of this contingency, is it possible for all members of this series that is causing the next member to be contingent? And there I explained that I guess I appeal to intuition that, okay, just that doesn't work. Like if we have that kind of society and everyone can only copy a book, where would that book come from? You know, like there must be one member that just writes the book in its original form. Because if everyone is copying from, then where does the original content of that book come from if everyone is just copying it? Now that's intuitively clear, but just to make it one step more clear, in that society, we have these members and they have these powers to copy from one book to another book, right? But that's the only thing that they can do. They don't have any other power to write originally, which means that if in that society there is no book, so imagine that society but without the book that they've been writing, that's a consistent society, right? There's no member there that wants to generate a new book. So if there were no book in that society, everything is fine, because they only have power to copy from a book that exists. So if there is no book, they wouldn't copy. There wouldn't be any book for the next person to copy. No one will copy anything. There wouldn't be any book. Which means that the existence of book in this society, that there is actually a book, is contingent. And this is regardless of the number of the members of that society. You can have infinite, you can have finite, doesn't matter. The point is, the existence of that book in that society is contingent. It doesn't have to exist. It could not exist. Which means, again, we need an explanation for that. But the point is that these two societies, these two conditions, on one side you have a book, on the other side you don't have a book, are exactly the same. They're exactly the same people, again, regardless of the number, with the same power. They can only write a book if there is another book. So there's nothing in the society itself and its members, finite or infinite, that explains the existence of the book. What selects between these two societies? That has to be something outside of it. So if there is something outside of it, then you can just keep going on that regress, and then you can see that we have to come to an end somewhere. This cannot go on forever, because you just keep adding layer upon layer, and then you have another regress, and within another regress. That has to have a kind of primary member. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to explain why this book exists rather than not exist. So that also kind of shines light on this concept that we're not really looking necessarily at a kind of first member in chain. It's not about being first. It's about being this primary element, this element that actually generates that book. It doesn't have to be like the first one, because if there is an infinite chain, then there is no first one. But there must be something that gave that original content to that society of infinite members, so they can start writing, so they can start copying from it. So that's just to make clear that why these kind of per se, as they're called, causal chains cannot go on forever, because that would violate the principle of sufficient reason. And hence we have to end up with a member that is not contingent. So that's about that part. That just give one additional layer to improve the argument there. So if that's true, then we will end up with a set of necessary beings. And then there I started to create these two different scenarios. On one side, ultimate explanation, and the other side, the infinite explanation options. And there I went into some details that, okay, if we have like these two members and then they can be different from what they are, and then we need an explanation for that, I believe that's not necessary to go into that level of details. It's still true that if we have more than one member, then both of them can be different from what they are. So if you have more than one human being, then both of them can be different from what they are, because there must be a difference between them. And if there is a difference between them and they're both human beings, then they could have had the other property. So if you're blonde, I'm not, and we are the only human being, then you could have had my hair color, I could have had your hair color as a human being. That's a possibility. So something caused my hair to be this color, and something caused your hair to be that color. So that's still true. I mean, if you have more than one member, then all of them would be different from what they are. But we don't need to go into details to get into these options. So the moment that we get into the set of necessary beings, we just ask a simple question. Is there any of these necessary beings that cannot be different from what it is? The answer is either yes or no. If the answer is yes, yes, there is a member of in there that cannot be different from what it is, then that just means that that's the only one. Because if we had more than one, then they could be different from what they are. So if there is such a member, checking something quickly, yeah. So if that's the only, if there is such a member, then that's the only necessary being. That's the ultimate option. That's the ultimate explanation option. And if someone says no, there is none of them that cannot be different from what it is, then that means all of them can be different from what they are, which means all of them require explanation by PSR, which means that the infinite explanation option. Now I put the infinite possible option aside for a moment. I want to keep it alive. It is a possibility, but I will come back to it. It's just it's not very it doesn't make that much sense. I will come back to it, and I will explain why, in my opinion, the infinite explanation basically reduces to no explanation. I don't have like a knockoff argument against it, at least yet, but I will think about it. So we have this option. So now we have this one necessary being that cannot be different from what it is. And then the next step was in the argument to show that the essence of this thing is its existence. That's what I wanted to show. But there I also went into details that I guess is not necessary. The other way to see the same conclusion is like this. Imagine, okay, let's call this one necessary being that cannot be different from what it is. Let's call it G. And now let's define another entity called F, which we don't know whether it exists or not, whose essence is actually its existence. So F's essence, what F is that it is. That's just what it is, to be. Okay, let's call F that. Now, there are two things. Now, we don't know whether it exists or not, and we actually don't care about that right now. What we do care about are these two a priori things that we can get out of this concept, that, okay, F, that's just what it is. The essence of S is to exist. There are two things. First, it's possible for that thing to exist. We don't know F exists or not, but we know that it's possible for it to exist because its essence does not prevent its existence. What it is just to be. There's nothing in there that prevents it from coming into existence, to make it impossible for it to come into existence, because that's what it is. So it's possible for it to be. And the second thing is that if that thing exists, if F exists, we don't know if it exists or not, but if that thing exists, then it will be a necessary being. Because if we have something, if we know something exists, that what it is to exist. The persistent condition of such a thing will make sure that it's a necessary thing. Because if that thing stops existing, that would be a contradiction, because how can something that we know that it exists and we know that what it is to exist fail to exist? That would be a contradiction. That's what it is. That the thing just is to exist. There's no other way. It's not possible for it not to be. So if it exists, then it's impossible for it not to be. So if it exists, and it is possible for it to exist, then it will be a necessary being. So now the question is, now this is just a priori things that we do on F. The question is G identical to F? The answer is either yes or no. If the answer is no, they're not identical, then that means that we can have, it's possible for us to have more than one necessary being. But if it's possible to have more than one necessary being, it means it's possible for G to be different from what it is, something that we proved is not possible. So it must be the other option. So F is identical to G. But if F is identical to G, it means that G's essence is its existence, which means that what G is to be. So therefore, we get to that final conclusion I was looking for. We have this one ultimate explanation causing everything to exist and whose essence is existence. What G is, which we will call God now, what God is to be. It's its existence. That's what God is. There's nothing in addition to that. Now going back to that infinite explanation part, that's the worldview in which everything requires an explanation. Everything. Now that does not make much sense to me, because when we ask for an explanation, there's something that we don't understand about it. And that lack of something, we try to compensate by providing more explanations, right? Now, the point is that if everything requires an explanation, we're basically saying that everything lacks that kind of explanation. But that also means that the explanations themselves lack something. But that's a problem, because when we explain something, even when we explain something partially, something is explained, something is understood by us. Now, it might not be the complete thing, but that partial thing, at least we understand it partially. But what we're saying is that that partial understanding itself seems to require an explanation. That lacks something on its own. Or in other words, the explanations themselves require explanation. But the point is, if the first explanation does not work because it lacks something, as we're saying, everything lacks everything requires an explanation. If the first explanation lacks something, how does the second one is going to help? See what I mean? So if we say, okay, the explanation that I'm providing requires an explanation, the second explanation that you want to provide will not add anything that the first one couldn't add, because then itself will lack it, and then itself will lack it, and they just go on forever. The whole concept of explanation seems to be emptied. If we say that everything requires an explanation, then explanations themselves would require an explanation. But how can that explanation add anything to the first explanation? But as I said, that's just, again, some kind of something that goes against my intuition. I should think more on it, like how to make sense of it and to make like a better argument of it. But that's definitely not something that everyone also wants to go there. No one wants to say that, hey, like, we're living in this world that everything requires an explanation. No, because even some people who don't want to go to the ultimate explanation, what they dream of is that they can show that there is something that just is not God, is not the ultimate explanation, but also doesn't need an explanation. That's just a brute fact. But the argument at least shows that the brute fact is impossible. We either have to say that everything requires an explanation, we have to provide it, so this can go on, so it has to go on forever, or we're dealing with an ultimate explanation. So these are a couple of points that I wanted to clear up in the argument, because the videos are kind of old, and now I'm looking back at them, I'm not very happy with all the details. Back at that time, I was very entangled with kind of metaphysical notations of Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle, and I was thinking in those terms. But now I'm going back and I'm thinking in different terms. So I just wanted to clarify and just remove some of the baggage from those metaphysics. But I hope that this clears up. I will also put my the link to my blog in the description, because there I basically update my thoughts, and I also write there the summary for the existence of God, and I try to keep that updated and fix all these issues that I explained here. So see you.